Okay, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Barbara Jones-Brown, who is the head of Signature Books, and she is now but a year, just over a year in that position.
Just over a year.
Okay, taking on the helm of Signature Books, which is, if you're not familiar with, the premier publisher of Mormon history, Mormon biography, and important works of many, many years. And we're grateful for the work that Barbara is continuing there, and now has her name officially as an author on this book, Vengeance is Mine. Now Rick has quite a long list of books. I only have a handful of them out on display here, but just to show you from the most recent, he did an updated edition of Victims, the LDS Church and the Mark Hoffman case, available in paperback. And then, I'm going to reach behind you, Gordon, excuse me. About a year ago, authored the biography of Dallin H. Oaks, In the Hands of the Lord. We have several copies here available if you're interested. And then, of course, as you all know, 15 years ago, wrote Massacre at Mount Meadows. If you're interested, these are actually first editions signed by all three authors, so we still have copies available 15 years later if you're interested in a signed copy. And they're only $40. They were $35 back then, so screaming deal for you. And then finally, the reason you're all here tonight, Vengeance is Mine, the Mountain Meadows Massacre and its aftermath. 15 years later, they cut the equivalent of a full book to make this a book. So I want to see the unabridged version someday, right? With that, I will turn the time over to, who's going to go first here? Barbara, and then after they both speak, we will do questions from the audience, and then we will have some refreshments out in the hallway. You're welcome to stay and enjoy those. If anyone needs to use the bathroom, the code on the door is 254. And if that doesn't work, then you haven't spent enough money, and I'll give you the real code. But, no, that should work. Anyway, anything else any questions really quick from the audience, anything before we get going? Okay, with that, we'll start. Here's Barbara. Do you want this?
Yes. Okay, can you all hear me, or do I need to put the mic higher? We're good? In the back? Okay, fantastic. If you start not being able to hear me, just give me a signal and I'll speak up. So, some of you may have seen in the Deseret News recently Lee Benson's column on our book. My husband's a veteran editor of the Deseret News, and he's always warning me, never read the comments. However, I held off for a week or so, but then I just couldn't restrain myself, and unfortunately I looked at the comments. And as was the case with the first book, a lot of people were judging this second book, saying what we did and didn't do before they had clearly even cracked the cover or even read the article itself. But one of the things that people brought up is, why are they doing another book? Don't we have enough books about the Mountain Meadows Massacre? Why another one? So I thought I'd kind of start with explaining that first. Can you hand me that one? So, as Chris said, Massacre at Mountain Meadows, we published it in 2008. I was the content editor of this book, so I was privileged to sit in all of the meetings with the three authors and to edit this book beginning in 2005. And in those meetings, we had, as we were finishing the book, we had a debate come up. Do we put everything, all of the information in one book, or we divide it in two? And these debates went on for quite a while. Ron Walker really wanted it all in one book. But this is what we concluded, and this is what is written in the preface of Massacre at Mountain Meadows. Well, I'll just read from the preface of this book explaining the preface of Massacre at Mountain Meadows. So we talked about the first book's publication, and then in this preface we write, yet the efforts that produced Massacre at Mountain Meadows were not complete. As the book's preface explained, after considering the overwhelming amount of source material gathered, we concluded, reluctantly, that too much information existed for a single book. Again, I'm quoting from this preface. Besides, two narrative themes emerged. One dealt with the story of the massacre, and the other with its aftermath. One with the crime, and the other with punishment. This first volume tells only the first half of the story, leaving the second half to another day. With the publication of Vengeance is Mine, the Mountain Meadows Massacre and its aftermath, that day has come, 15 years later. So it's been a labor of love. If you've read either one of the books, you know how difficult it is to engage with this horrific tragedy and the events that led to it. So it's a great pleasure to be finished with it now. And Rick and I were saying, after being in the trenches alone, just the two of us for 14 years working on this book, going back and forth, to finally being able to share it with the world. And we're so grateful to all of you who have read the book and the positive response it's been receiving so far. So one of the questions that we often get asked is about the cover-up. So that's what my paper tonight is about, the cover-up. And then Rick will be talking about one of the other questions that comes up quite a bit, about the trials of John D. Lee and why he was the only one convicted and executed for the crime. Let me begin by making clear that the massacre itself was a cover-up. After a September 7, 1857 assault on a group of immigrants encamped at southern Utah's Mountain Meadows did not go according to plan, these California-bound immigrants quickly circled their wagons and dug in. Within hours, the immigrants became aware that white Latter-day Saints were involved in their attack, in which several of the wagon company had been killed. Nearby, Cedar City Militia Major and State President Isaac Haight hastily made the decision that all the immigrant witnesses must be silenced. He privately received authorization from Southern Utah's militia commander and Parowan State President William Dame to call out Cedar City militiamen to wipe out the witnesses besieged at the Meadows. Only the children too young to tell tales were to be spared. Haight and the other perpetrators tried to make the atrocity appear to outsiders as if no white men were involved. They dragged to a ravine the bodies of the immigrant men who'd fallen in a straight line when the militiamen walking alongside them suddenly shot them in the head. But they left the butcher remains of the women and children scattered around the ground where they had been hewn down while scattering and running for their lives. Only 17 children aged 6 and under were spared. Massacre perpetrator and Cedar City Bishop Philip Klingensmith separated the children from their surviving siblings, cousins, and playmates and placed them in different homes throughout southern Utah. Massacre leader and Fort Harmony founder John D. Lee said we was not to ask them any questions whatever, recalled Harmony resident Annie Elizabeth Hogue. Nothing was to be said to the children that might cause them to remember. The perpetrators wanted them to forget everything that had transpired from this affair. 2 days after the massacre, upon receiving Brigham Young's letter that came too late, instructing Haight to, quote, let the immigrants go in peace, Haight began covering up the militiamen's involvement in the crime, not only to outsiders, but also to fellow Latter-day Saints. He immediately sent notice of Young's letter to other settlements where massacre perpetrators lived. At Cedar City Sunday service that afternoon, Haight spoke on the spirit of the times and accused local Indians of being fired up with the spirit of their fathers. Before notice of Young's letter reached the settlements of Fort Harmony and Washington, perpetrators there rejoiced in the massacre in their September 13th church meetings. Speaking to his Harmony congregation, John D. Lee placed responsibility for the massacre on himself, on other white men, and on Indians. But after Haight's notice of Young's letter arrived, Lee began covering up white involvement and laying blame solely on Indians. The citizens of Harmony were called together and told that if they ever mentioned a word of Lee's speech of Sunday, recalled a Harmony resident, their throats would be cut. Similar events unfolded in the settlement of Washington. My friend Sandra Tanner is here. Just this afternoon we were talking about how both of our ancestors, Harrison Pierce and William S. Hawley, were in the settlement of Washington. That's not something we're proud of, but our ancestors together participated in this horrific crime. Messengers were sent around enjoining upon the people to keep their mouths closed. Cedar City resident Mary Campbell remembered. The messenger said, for example, that even if you were to see a dead man laying on your woodpile, you must not tell, but go about your business. Another resident, Mary White, likewise remembered that everybody was silenced not to speak about it. Haight knew he had to enforce silence because, as White said, the people of Cedar was aware of the whites being guilty. Haight soon had a talk with John D. Lee. Haight insisted that Lee be the one to report the massacre to Brigham Young and to do it in person. Lee hesitated, asking why Haight didn't just send a written report. Because you could tell him more satisfactorily than I could write, Haight replied, encouraging Lee to stand up and shoulder as much of the responsibility as he could conveniently. Though Haight and Dame knew that they, like Lee, were about to go to Salt Lake themselves for General Conference, they wanted to hide behind Lee, and Lee played right into their hands. On September 29, 1857, Lee walked into Young's Salt Lake City office, looking travel-worn in the morning light. Though Lee requested a private interview, Young had assistant church historian and diarist Wilford Woodruff join them in Young's inner office. Within the previous 2 weeks, a Ute man had told Indian interpreter Dimmick Huntington that the Paiutes had killed the whole of an emigrant company and took all of their stock, and it was right, which Huntington likely reported to Young. Just the day before, rumors of an Indian massacre in Mountain Meadows reached Salt Lake. Now Lee, who lived near the Meadows, came before the church president. Though the massacre took place 18 days earlier, Lee feigned that he came as an express rider, implying the atrocity occurred more recently. Telling the real date of the crime would have cast suspicion on southern Utah leaders for taking so long to report it. So for generations, it was very difficult to pin down the actual date of the massacre, which was on September 11th. For a long time, they thought it was much later. Thank you. Lee brought an awful tale of blood, Woodruff recorded. A company of California-bound immigrants came through the territory with numerous cattle and horses, Lee began. He asserted they belonged to the mob in Missouri and Illinois. As they traveled south, they went damning Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, and the heads of the church, saying that Joseph Smith ought to have been shot a long time before he was. Next, Lee launched into a false poisoning story. The emigrants wanted to do all the evil they could, he claimed, so they poisoned beef and gave it to the Indians, and some of them died. Lee also said several of the saints died from springs the emigrants poisoned. After dishing up plenty of both Indian and white motive, Lee said only the Indians became enraged at the emigrants' conduct, surrounding them on a prairie. To defend themselves, the emigrants formed a bulwark of their wagons. But the Indians fought them 5 days until they killed all their men, about 60 in number. And everything that I'm sharing is from Wilford Woodruff's diary that he was recording that night, or perhaps even simultaneously, of this conversation. Omitting mention of his own role in luring the emigrants from the safety of their wagon forth with false promises of protection, Lee lied that Indians rushed into their corral and cut the throats of their women and children, except 8 or 10 children, which they sold to the whites. Finally, he said the Indians stripped the men and women naked and left them stinking in the boiling sun. Lee continued his victim blaming as if to justify their murder. Many of the men and women was rotten with the pox, meaning venereal disease, before they were hurt by the Indians, he claimed. He did not think there was a drop of innocent blood in their camp. He had taken in 2 of the surviving children and could not get but one to kneel down in prayer, and the other would laugh at her for doing it. And, he added, the children swore like pirates, as if any of this justified murder. At some point, Young interrupted the chilling account. Despite Lee's many accusations against the emigrants, Young said the story of their slaughter was heartrending. The church president's reaction gave Lee pause. Young did not express satisfaction with the emigrants' deaths, but rather showed sympathy. Years later, Lee wrote in his journal, Brigham Young knew nothing of the Mountain Massacre until it was all over, and very much regretted it when he heard of it. Though Lee and other militiamen took control of much of the slain emigrants' property, he lied to Young and Woodruff that Indians obtained all their cattle, horses, property, guns, etc. By the time Lee finished his story, Young had to escape the 4 walls of his office. President Young left the office 11 a.m. in his carriage for his upper mill, his health being feeble, recorded a clerk. Almost a year later, in July 1858, William Dame called John D. Lee to Parowan to share rumors that U.S. Army troops would soon be passing through en route to California. Reports also says that some 1,000 troops are expected to establish a post at the Mountain Meadows, Lee recorded. Dame also likely shared the news that the federally appointed Indian Affairs Superintendent of Utah, Jacob Forney, was investigating the massacre and planned to come south to retrieve the surviving children to return them to their anxious relatives in Arkansas. Dame likely had a similar conversation with Haight the next day when he joined him for Cedar City's militia musters. Haight told us all to join the know-nothings, to mind our own business and hold our tongues, etc., recorded a militiaman of the musters. In a church meeting the following day, a Cedar man spoke on keeping a closed mouth and minding the Mormon creed of minding your own business. Another leader also spoke on the Mormon creed and knowing nothing that will injure our brethren in righteousness. These kinds of messages reverberated throughout the region, not only with fears of federal troops and investigators on the horizon, but also as Latter-day Saint Apostle George A. Smith came to tour southern Utah settlements. Local priesthood leaders preached of bridling the tongue, of the evil in speaking against our neighbors, and of watching ourselves in the place of watching our neighbors, and of being united. Cedar City's Relief Society leaders advised the women to guard against tattling, etc., to be watchful of their words and not to misrepresent anything, and to mind our own business, that we were not called to watch the whole city, but to watch ourselves. At Fort Harmony, Lee went from house to house to stir up the saints and pin down their loyalties. Massacre perpetrators carefully guided Apostle Smith through their settlements and along the route that passed through the Mountain Meadows. We visited the ground where the emigrants and Indians had their battle last year, Smith recorded. The wolves had apparently torn out nearly all the bodies from the graves. Their bones, lying scattered all around, were undergoing a process of rapid decomposition. Smith incorrectly concluded that the emigrant men had run away and left the women, and made no mention of the many child victims of the massacre. His interpretation of the massacre was highly flawed, despite his being surrounded by, or because he was surrounded by, the men who had carried out the massacre and knew better. On August 17th, Smith wrote a report to Brigham Young about, quote, the difficulties between the emigrants and Indians, which terminated in the horrible massacre at the Mountain Meadows. His letter claimed the emigrants conducted themselves in a hostile manner, not only toward the Indians, but also the white citizens, threatening to destroy the town of Fillmore, boasting of their participation in Missouri and Illinois mobs, and poisoning a spring in Ox that caused the death of a Mormon boy. In the settlements further south, Smith's letter claimed the emigrants planned to fatten their stock to sell to approaching troops, then help to kill every Mormon. After listening to accounts from Parowan residents, none of whom participated in the massacre, Smith did acknowledge their reports that John D. Lee and a few other white men were on the ground during a portion of the combat. But for what purpose, or how they conducted, or whether indeed they were there at all, I have not learned. Smith's failure to ascertain the truth about the massacre during his 1858 investigations is troubling when compared to what federal appointees in Utah were able to uncover after their investigations in southern Utah less than a year later. Indian Affairs Superintendent Jacob Forney examined the carnage at the Mountain Meadows. He interviewed local resident Jacob Hamlin, who was in Salt Lake on the day of the massacre. Forney interviewed the oldest of the 17 surviving children, and massacre participants David Tullis, John D. Lee, Isaac Haight, and John Higbee. After these investigations, Forney reported he had learned enough of the material facts of the Mountain Meadow affair to relieve this world of the white hellhounds who have disgraced humanity by being mainly instrumental in the murdering of at least 115 men, women, and children. Forney provided a list of these alleged perpetrators to the federally appointed 2nd District Judge John Cradlebaugh. When the perpetrators were arrested and brought to trial, Forney promised he could furnish all the evidence that he needed to convict them. Judge Cradlebaugh then conducted his own investigation, beginning with the killing fields at the Mountain Meadows. He interviewed the Santa Clara Paiutes just south of the Meadows, who, quote, admitted that a portion of their men were engaged in the massacre, led by John D. Lee and John Higbee. Cradlebaugh secured a vacant house in Cedar City to stay in and use as a courthouse. When word spread throughout the area that Cradlebaugh intended to hold a court of investigation, backed by troops to ensure protection, the judge began getting late-night knocks at his door. Under cover of darkness, several informants shared what they knew, asking him to not reveal their identity for fear their lives would be endangered. They asked Cradlebaugh not to acknowledge them if he met them in public. The anonymous informants at Cedar corroborated much of what the Santa Clara Paiutes and the oldest surviving children said. Cradlebaugh wrote, "They gave me every assurance that they would furnish an abundance of evidence in regard to the matter so soon as they were assured of military protection. At least one informant had even participated in the massacre and agreed, if protected, to be a witness." We believe that was Philip Klingensmith, who turned state's evidence. Based on the testimonies of the Cedar City informants and the Santa Clara Paiutes, the judge pieced together his own interpretation of the crime. Forney and Cradlebaugh's findings were very close to what Rick and I found through our own research over the years as historians. But Young chose to favor the report shared with him by his own trusted men over the findings of these outsiders. He would only learn and accept more of the truth when his fellow Latter-day Saints revealed to him more of what actually took place at the Mountain Meadows Massacre. In 1870, Brigham Young and his traveling party toured southern Utah. At some point during the trip, resident apostle Erastus Snow communicated to President Young the facts about the massacre as he had learned them since moving to the region and the sources of his information. A local bishop also bluntly told Young that he did not know the truth and had been misled and deceived about the matter. "If you want to know the truth about it," the bishop said, "ask Nephi Johnson, and he will tell you." Somebody said there are Johnson descended here. A few, yeah. Johnson was soon called to Salt Lake where, he said, Young requested me to tell him all I knew of the whole affair. Young had previously read non-Mormon investigators' accounts of the massacre, but chose to believe what his own trusted men reported to him of the atrocity, including George A. Smith. But now Johnson, a Latter-day Saint participant of the crime, stood before him, backing up much of what non-Mormon investigators had found and refuting what fellow church members had said. As a Paiute interpreter who participated in the massacre, Johnson knew the prime movers of the crime were not Indians, and later testified that white men did most of the killing. He knew that Lee played a leading role from the first attack to the final slaughter, but that Lee was not alone. Isaac Haight had orchestrated the plan to wipe out the immigrant witnesses besieged at the Meadows and sent militiamen there to carry out that plan. As Johnson relayed this true version of events, Young paced the floor, deeply impressed and several times interjecting, "Why did Lee lie to me?" Believing Johnson's statement that many who took part in the massacre did so under duress and at their militia leaders' orders, Young said he would not hold the younger men responsible but would punish the leaders. He soon acted on what he had learned. Between the church's General Conference sessions on October 8, 1870, Wilford Woodruff recorded that we held a council at noon at President Young's office. The First Presidency and Quorum of the 12 Apostles, by unanimous vote, cut off or excommunicated Isaac Haight and John D. Lee for committing a great sin, and they were not to have the privilege of returning to the church again in this life. Apostle Joseph F. Smith wrote of the meeting, "John D. Lee and I. Haight were cut off the church because of extreme wickedness, or for having been engaged in the MMM." In summary, the massacre perpetrators committed the atrocity to silence witnesses who had become aware that Latter-day Saints were involved in a botched assault on their wagon and cattle company. Massacre leaders then tried to cover up the massacre to outsiders by blaming the slaughter on Indians. After they received Young's letter 2 days after the massacre to let the immigrants go in peace, they began covering up the crime to their fellow Latter-day Saints, including their church leaders. And their church leaders believed their version of events rather than the investigations of outsiders. Only when a Latter-day Saint witness and participant of the crime revealed the full story to Brigham Young did Young comprehend and finally accept the enormity of the atrocity committed by some of his people in southern Utah. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yep. I don't know when I first heard about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. I grew up in a family with a very interesting genealogy. My father's mother was from Cedar City, Utah. And although I have no ancestors who participated directly in the Mountain Meadows Massacre, I have shirt-tail cousin relationships to most of the major perpetrators. On the other hand, my mother's father is from Carroll County, Arkansas, which is home base for many of the immigrants. I spent my elementary school days in the Midwest, and we would travel to my mother's homeland in the Ozarks and down into Arkansas. I became familiar with that culture region. When I was doing research on my family history, I found a wedding license for my great uncle signed by J. Polk Fancher. And as I did further research, I found out that even though I don't have any direct ancestors who were killed at the massacre or survived the massacre among the 17 children, I do have 22 shirt-tail relatives who were victims of the massacre. So with that interesting genealogy, I can't tell you for certain when I first heard about the massacre. But I began my deep dive into Latter-day Saint church history when I was 15 years old and living in Washington State. It became a topic of great interest to me to understand about the early origins of the church and its history through time. I'm certain that I knew about the massacre in high school. When I was a senior in high school, I was made the academic vice president of the Salt Lake Valley North Seminary District Council. One of my duties was to write the Seminary Bowl questions for 15 high schools in the Salt Lake Valley, and then to be the judge for the Seminary Bowl competitions. And I'm sure that somewhere in there I had written a question about the Mountain Meadows Massacre while I was still in high school. I do remember reading about the massacre on my mission. We didn't have the same restrictions on what you could read back in those days, and I read voraciously. Then when I got back from my mission and went to school and graduated, I graduated in law, spent less than a year practicing law, and then joined what was then called the Historical Department of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in January of 1986. In the latter 80s, we were working with descendants of the victims and descendants of the perpetrators to erect a new monument at Mountain Meadows, the first one that had been erected there since 1932. And so that gave us a chance to associate with relatives on both sides of this story. Glenn M. Leonard, director of what was then called the Museum of Church History and Art, reported directly to me. And he talked to me a lot about the massacre. That occupied a lot of the time that he and I spent together. In 1990, we dedicated a monument on what's referred to as Dan Sill Hill, and we deliberately made it a Vietnam War memorial-style monument with the names of the victims on there as best they could be compiled by a committee of people working on it. It's not a perfect list, so don't rely on that. Rely on the list in the back of Massacre at Mountain Meadows. But it was our first effort to have a kind of memorial there. Around the same time that we dedicated that monument in 1990, I was asked by the people putting together the 5-volume Encyclopedia of Mormonism to co-author the article on the Mountain Meadows Massacre with Ron Esplin. And so I published my first Mountain Meadows piece in 1992 when that encyclopedia came out, meaning that I've been writing on the massacre for more than 30 years now. After the 1990 monument was completed, it felt like we still had more work to be done at Mountain Meadows. And the new president of the church in the mid-90s, Gordon B. Hinckley, had a deep interest in the subject. When he was still relatively young and his father was very old, he took his father to the Mountain Meadows to see the 1932 monument there. Now, Juanita Brooks had just published her book on the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Both President Hinckley, then Elder Hinckley, and his father were deep students of Latter-day Saint history. And so they both went there together, and it moved them both. And President Hinckley decided that if he ever had an opportunity in the future to do something to commemorate this and try to make it right, he would do so. So in the mid-90s, we began talking about another monument at the Mountain Meadows, this one to be built in the valley where the 1932 monument was deteriorating. And I recall being invited into a meeting in the North Boardroom of the Church Administration Building, a meeting run by President Hinckley, with descendants of the victims of the massacre. President Hinckley got up and he said, "I've been down there recently to look at the monument. It's deteriorating. The stone cairn is filled with tumbleweeds. We want to go in and reconstruct that so that it's a suitable monument to your family members." And so he said to them, "You can have whatever you want down there. I've taken the liberty of having some of our local designers create some ideas, but you do whatever you want." So he then proposed some ideas. The descendants of the victims chose it, and in 1999, President Hinckley dedicated the monument down in the valley that replaced the 1932 monument that had been built. All this time, of course, I'm thinking about this subject and thinking we ought to write a book. Certainly, this subject, which initially went through a period of denial and then trying to limit blame to just John D. Lee or to Paiutes, and then continuing to try to bury it for a while. Certainly, I thought we've reached the age as a state and as a religious community at which we can face this topic square in the face, full on, and have a no-holds-bar approach to it. And so I talked to church leaders about it and said, I want to do this. And I want to do it with 3 provisos. Number 1, we do it full on, straight, completely open, and we let the chips fall where they may, no matter who they hit. Number 2, that I and my co-authors retain full editorial control of the contents of the book. In other words, it will not go through correlation, it will not go through review committees. It will be whatever we want it to be. And number 3, that we get all of the information that the church has on this subject including material that was denied to Juanita Brooks, as she describes in her book. And the church leaders agreed. So we got access to the Juanita Brooks material, and after we published Massacre at Mount Meadows, one reason it took so long to get around to the second volume was Ron Walker and I decided we were going to take all those documents that Juanita Brooks didn't get, and we were going to publish them. So here you have published images of every scrap of paper that was denied to her with transcriptions and notes. So we published this volume called Mount Meadows Massacre, the Andrew Jensen and David H. Morris Collections. It was jointly published by the University of Utah and BYU Presses. Dennis, I need to back up and fill in a little bit about what Barbara said regarding the history of why we have 2 volumes. When we first took on this project, Ron Walker, Glenn Leonard, and I, we thought it's a big topic, and so we divided it up into 6 parts. Part 1 was to be the history of the immigrants who died at Mountain Meadows and their lives up to the time they reached Utah. Because of my background in the Midwest and having a cultural relationship to that area, I got the responsibility for writing that first part. Part 2 was going to take the immigrants from the time they arrived in Utah down through Utah to the Mountain Meadows. And Ron Walker, as a professor of Utah history, got the assignment to write that part. Then Glenn Leonard was going to write the 3rd part of the book, which was the massacre itself. Then the 4th part of the book was to be the aftermath. And that was going to be taken by Ron Walker. And then we would get to the legal parts, the investigation, the indictments, the first trial, the second trial, and the execution. And that would be mine because of my legal training. And then finally, the 6th part would be done by Glenn Leonard, which would be a history of the massacre from John D. Lee's execution up to the present time. Well, as we didn't know then, but we certainly know now, that was far more than we could possibly fit within the covers of a single book. By the time we got to 2007, that was apparent. And it was also apparent that the subject of the Mountain Meadows Massacre was sucking the life out of us. Ron Walker and Glenn Leonard both had become very tired by then. Ron had repeatedly said, I want off this project. I'm done. Glenn Leonard said, I have more I want to do in my life besides this. And so we decided to make the difficult decision that Barbara mentioned of cutting the project in half and putting half out first as Massacre at Mount Meadows and promising a second half to be published later. Now, why didn't the second half get published sooner? My wife Shirley and I have some property in Idaho just west of Yellowstone. I love the Yellowstone area. I like to go up there whenever I can. If you go up into the Yellowstone area and you go into the geyser basins or elsewhere, you got to be really careful about walking off of the trail. Because you can be walking at what seems like really solid ground and all of a sudden it caves in underneath you and you end up in boiling water. Well, researching the second half of this story turned out to be like walking in a geyser basin at Yellowstone. I thought the sources that we'd need for the second half of the book were rock-solid sources. I mean, after all, we had John D. Lee's written confessions in Mormonism Unveiled. That had to be an important source. We also were aware of 2 separate transcripts of the Lee trials. I mean, what could be more reliable than legal documents? Well, the more we walked on this surface, the more it kept caving in and getting us into hot water. Okay? We learned ultimately that Lee's so-called confessions are highly unreliable. And why is that? Well, we found correspondence down at the Huntington Library in which he writes back and forth with his lawyer. Near the end of his life, he had no money to pay his lawyer, so agreed to give him the legal rights to his story. And so the lawyer kept writing to him and saying, okay, your execution's coming up, get me the story, get me the story. And just a few weeks before Lee's scheduled to be executed, he finally sends the manuscript to his lawyer, who takes a look at it and writes back contemporaneously and says, this is not good. This is your story up through 1848 before you come to Utah. That's worthless to me. I need your story in Utah and I need the massacre. So I'll tell you what, you give me your journals and I'll make it work out somehow. So Lee's journals show him gathering up his journals. He turns them over to his lawyer. And then when his so-called confessions come out, they claim that Brigham Young gathered up his journals and had them destroyed. Now, why would that be in Mormonism Unveiled? Because nobody wants them to be able to go back and compare what's in the supposed confessions with Lee's actual journals. Well, years later, many of those journals end up being donated to the Huntington Library in San Marino by descendants of Lee's lawyer and the Marshal Nelson. And when you take all that data and you put it together, you begin to look at John D. Lee's so-called confessions, they're not reliable, okay? They're not reliable. And we could spend an entire time talking about that, but I'm just going to jump over that now to the legal documents. When we started to look at the transcripts of John D. Lee's trials, these things I thought, these have got to be reliable historical documents. We began to break through the surface of the ground again and hit boiling water. Yes, there were two different transcripts of the Lee trials. One of those was the official transcript, but it had never been taken and put into a form to be completely readable by normal readers of English. It was shorthand. And the judge, later on, Judge Jacob Borman, decided he was going to write a book about it, so he had a student, not the actual person who wrote the shorthand, but a student of his, try to transcribe it, and had a lot of difficulty, okay? And that one was not complete. The other one was one prepared by a court reporter at the request of church leaders. And we have correspondence from that man saying that he edited it substantially, okay? So we had two transcripts, neither one of which was reliable. Fortunately, we had a colleague, Legene Purcell Caruth, who could read Pittman shorthand. We had to start from scratch, find the original shorthand notebooks for the trials, which were basically at the Huntington Library and at church headquarters, and we had all of those retranscribed by Legene. Then we gathered all of the historical documents which were scattered about, and we pulled all of those together into this 2-volume set. Mountain Meadows Massacre collected legal papers. This took years and years and years to finally give us a reliable set of documents on which we could base our writing. So that's a reason why this took so long to complete. Without these, we couldn't really know what was going on. The historiography on the investigations and the trials of John D. Lee and other legal documents pertaining to the other people who were guilty was largely a set of lore that had been passed from one mouth to another mouth to another mouth and published over time, and wasn't an accurate representation of what actually happens. You really need to read the book, and if you're really a glutton for punishment, these 2 volumes, plus we created a website, mountainmeadowsmassacre.org, because we couldn't fit it all into here. And we have over 4,000 pages on that website, okay, giving you the 2 shorthand versions, the early transcriptions, and our transcription, all in parallel columns so you can compare it all. Now you can imagine that was a lot of work to do. So finally we got to where we could explain what had happened in the trials. So when we tackled that, what we came to realize is that the traditional story we hear about the trials is not accurate. So the story we sometimes hear is that Brigham Young tried to interfere with the administration of justice until it was apparent he could no longer do so, at which time he fingered John D. Lee as a scapegoat. And then church leaders basically somehow behind the scenes got to jurors in the first trial to make sure that Lee wasn't convicted. And then somehow or another they flipped, maybe because of bribery, and ended up in the second trial by convicting John D. Lee, orchestrating it all from church headquarters. And then John D. Lee was executed. That's the story we heard over and over and over again. And I had no problem with that story if it was true. I mean, the truth is the truth, and what we were out for is whatever that happened to be. But we found out that this story was mostly lore. Okay, so I'm just going to tell you briefly what you can read in much greater detail in Vengeance is Mine. The way that John D. Lee gets chosen to become on the point of the spear, the legal spear if you will, is actually quite simple. In 1874, members of the Liberal Party, the non-Mormon party in Utah, went to Washington in an effort to get strong legislation against Latter-day Saints that would disenfranchise them, that would keep them from voting and would keep them off of juries. Leading that charge was Robert Baskin, who had been a candidate, wanted to be a candidate to be Utah's representative. And so he knew that he would be unable to do that so long as he was not approved by church leaders. In those days, Latter-day Saints, devout Latter-day Saints, voted by block as chosen by their senior leaders. So it was impossible for somebody coming in from the outside to get senior offices without church leaders' approvals, unless it was an appointed office from Washington. So Baskin and others went to Washington. They campaigned to try to get Latter-day Saints disenfranchised. People in Congress looked at that and they said, you know, that's kind of rough to take the majority population of a territory and disenfranchise all of them, take all of their vote away from them and their right to serve on juries. So instead, they passed what became known as the Poland Act of 1874, a watered-down version that retained the right to vote for church members, but made it so that in order to get juries, you basically pick every other one to make sure you get a mixed jury. In 1874, then, Judge Jacob Borman convened the very first grand jury under the Poland Act, and a mixed grand jury of Latter-day Saints and others secretly indicted 9 people for their roles in the massacre. 5 of those 9 were linchpins of the massacre. Isaac Haight, who basically planned it, William Dame, who was the senior military leader in southern Utah who approved the massacre, John D. Lee, who, as you know, played a role throughout going in under a white flag and luring the people out and participating in the massacre itself, Philip Klingensmith, who was on the ground as well participating, and John M. Higbee. Now, there were others who were indicted who were not as responsible. We describe all this in the book. But they got at least 5 of the main characters there indicted. So with that list of 9 people indicted, the marshals got from the court subpoenas, and they went out trying to find these people to arrest them. William Dame basically just did nothing and allowed people to arrest him because he thought he could somehow get off. And he had a reason for thinking that. His giving of the order to commit the massacre was done in a meeting of just 3 people. And 2 of those people, in what was known as the Tanbar Council, you can read about it in either one of the books. But he knew that both of the other participants in that would be party if they said anything about it. So he figured he was safe. And so he allowed himself to be arrested. John D. Lee was arrested under very colorful circumstances that we describe in the book. Basically, he'd gone on a conjugal visit to Penguich to see one of his wives there, and they pinned him down there in a chicken coop. And then, as they're getting ready to arrest him, they noticed that members of his family have the ends of guns sticking through the house on the law enforcement. Anyway, it's a very colorful story. They do arrest him. So now they've got Dame, and they've got Lee, and they ultimately get 3 other people in custody. One of whom is Philip Klingensmith. Well, Klingensmith had long ago agreed to turn state's evidence. So of these 5 in custody, only 3 were linchpins, key people. Dame, whom they wanted the most for 2 reasons. 1, he was the senior military leader to give the order, and 2, he was the stake president. They wanted to grab church leaders, okay? So they had him in custody, they wanted to go after him. They had Klingensmith who had already agreed to turn state's evidence, and then they had Lee. So they went to Lee and they said, we're going to make a plea agreement with you. You have 2 counts against you. If you merely agree to write a confession, then we will drop 1 count, even before you write it. If your confession is satisfactory, we'll drop the 2nd count and you'll walk just like Klingensmith. So Lee talked to his lawyers. They said, that's the deal you're going to get. You better take it. So Lee agreed to do that, but then he wrote a very thin confession that didn't indict Dame. And when that turned out to be the case, the prosecutors looked at it and said, you haven't helped us at all. We want to go after Dame. So because you didn't help, we're going to go after you instead. So that's how Lee ends up being on the point of the spear. He's indicted by a federal grand jury, and then given a plea bargain, he refuses to cop on Dame, and so they make him the key person they're going after. Now, that's how he gets selected. Now, what happens in the first trial? What actually happens in the first trial is highly interesting and is tied in with Utah politics at the time. As I mentioned, the Liberal Party, so Utah had a two-party system at the time. The Liberal Party was the non-Latter-day Saint Party, and the People's Party was the Latter-day Saint Party. And the Liberal Party went to Washington in 1874 trying to get the Latter-day Saints disenfranchised. Didn't work. So when the members of the Liberal Party got a chance to prosecute John D. Lee in the first trial, they made a conscious decision: we're going to throw the trial. Now you might say, why? Well, the answer is political reasons. They kept campaigning to have the Latter-day Saints disenfranchised on the basis of two topics that were sure to get public attention: sex and violence. Sex was polygamy, and violence was the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Now they thought, if we throw the first trial and it ends up with a hung jury, then we can go back to Washington and say, see, these Mormons don't deserve self-government because they can't even convict one of their own who's obviously guilty of a crime. So in the jury selection process, they make certain basically it's going to be a hung jury. And so the trial itself just becomes a show trial. They're playing to the Associated Press and other reporters that are in the audience there to try to get newspapers to publish the story they want to hear, particularly in the Eastern press, so that Congress will vote in their favor after the trial ends in a hung jury. Well, it ends in a hung jury just as they wanted it to. They go back to Washington, they campaign and say, see, they need tougher legislation, and Congress doesn't buy it. And they release the existing prosecutors who were so tied up in this political game, and they sent out a new prosecutor who doesn't have a political dog in the fight. He comes in. Meanwhile, Brigham Young becomes very concerned about the massacre as a topic by 1859, 2 years later. He initially gets some stories, but then he starts hearing a few other things. He wants it investigated. Beginning in 1859, he goes to the federal prosecutors and he says, do it your way. Now, it's been said in the past that Brigham Young wanted it prosecuted in probate courts in Utah so he could control it. We found a document in the Deseret alphabet that had never been transcribed. We have the gene transcribe it. It shows Brigham Young going to the federal prosecutor and saying, no, you do it your way. Have it done in federal court, but let's get this case investigated. I only ask that you hold the court close enough to the witnesses that they're not badly inconvenienced by having to go a long distance. The federal prosecutor tries to get it done, then he gets sick, he hands it on to somebody else. It never happens in 1859. Brigham Young renews that offer through the years. When the new prosecutor comes in 1876, he takes Brigham Young up on the offer. And so Brigham Young, through Daniel H. Wells, arranges to get witnesses into court in the second trial of John D. Lee. That's how Nephi Johnson and others get there. And they all testify against Lee. They're co-participants. They testify against Lee. Now that has two effects. One, Lee is convicted. He was guilty. Number two, it makes Lee extremely angry because the people who convict him are fellow participants in the massacre. Now it's been said that somehow they might have bribed the prosecutor, done something else to stop the prosecutions with Lee and to end it all, so that's the end of the story. But that proves not to be true. There's plenty of correspondence showing both the prosecutor and the judge continuing with their efforts to prosecute other participants in the massacre. They particularly wanted Isaac Haight and John Higbee and William Stewart, who were still on the lam. They made efforts to arrest them, came close at time, but never got to it. So why didn't anybody else get prosecuted? It's really pretty simple. John D. Lee's executed March 23, 1877. Brigham Young dies in August of that year. George A. Smith died in 1875. For political purposes, they wanted to go after Brigham Young and George A. Smith. When those two died, the Mountain Meadows lost its political appeal to the prosecutors. So they turned their attention from violence to sex and began ramping up their prosecutions of polygamists, leading to the raid period of the 1880s and ultimately the Woodruff Manifesto of 1890. So that's it in a nutshell. For more, read those, these, and the website. Thank you.
questions?
Yeah, right here.
Yeah, there's two discrepancies in the historical record that have kind of perplexed me for years. One is one you mentioned, Barbara, which is this Lee telling Young this late date for the massacre, and he gets confused. But what has always perplexed me about that is wouldn't Young have been confused by that, given the Haslam letter, and knowing that timeline had to be off from the initial siege?
Okay.
And then the second one is,
Can we just answer the first one and then we'll come to your second one, or otherwise we'll forget the first one. Okay, so to repeat the question, he was confused between like the discrepancies in the date that Lee told him it was much later than it was, much closer to September 29th when he reports to Young. And sorry.
did that cause confusion over the fact of the Haslam letter?
Okay, yeah, but the Haslam letter arrives in Young's office in September 10th. So why didn't Young think that, it happened closer to when that letter arrives? We can't be sure. One possibility is that, I was just thinking about this the other day, is they may have waited for so long to report it also so that it seemed like it wasn't that company that Young told them to let go, but it was a different company. By saying that it didn't occur, close to September 10th, it occurred 2 or 3 weeks later to show, it wasn't that company, it was a different one. But, yeah, we can't be sure.
And also, they wanted to blame it on Paiutes. So if they delay from the time period that he sends down his note telling them to back off, then they can make it look as though they followed his instructions. And then a little bit later, Paiutes performed it without any role on their part.
The second one is Jacob Hamblin. He testifies, I can't remember which of the trials, that John D. Lee, when he comes up towards the end of September, basically gives him a full confession.
Yeah.
That seems completely inconsistent with
Yep.
everything else Lee and Hamblin and Young and everyone else is doing around.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that I had myself. So to repeat the question, Jacob Hamlin testifies in the second trial that Lee confesses everything to him in 1857. And so it doesn't make sense with all the other events that are going on, because Hamlin doesn't seem to know the full story either. He seems to kind of incrementally learn it. So I had that exact same question, and looking at the contemporary sources, we could not verify that Lee did in fact tell Hamlin that in 1857. And Lee denies, when he hears Hamlin saying in the second trial that Hamlin's saying, well, Lee confessed doing this to me, Lee is furious, and he says, I never said that to Hamlin. So treachery of memory, it's 20 years later, so Hamlin may have remembered it incorrectly, but the contemporary sources don't show that Lee laid it all out to Hamlin in 57, as Hamlin claimed in that trial testimony. So, and it goes into that very thoroughly in the book, so.
Here.
Right there.
You talk about the massacre occurred because of a botched first attack.
Mhm.
Were people killed in that? And
Yes.
is there evidence of, were they trying to massacre them the first time? Or what?
Yeah.
Why did they feel the need to actually massacre everyone the second time?
Okay.
Were they intending to do that?
Great. Yeah, so the question was, as we mentioned, the original assault on the immigrants at Mount Meadows was a botched assault, a botched attack. And so then why then did they decide to massacre them 5 days later? So what happens is, and again, we go into it in the book, but there are all these cattle raids taking place, led by Indian missionaries, interpreters, and local Indian tribes throughout the territory between September 7th and October 3rd. In none of those was there a massacre. We know of one man that was killed in one of these attacks that took place in northern Utah. But this was, I don't want to take too much time, but this was part of Young's strategy to try and convince the federal government that if you send troops into Utah, all hell is going to break loose, and we're not going to hold the Indians back anymore. But privately, he's encouraging raiding. So just as with these other attacks, these assaults where no one is killed, except in one case where one person is killed, something goes awry, and a few immigrant men are killed in that initial attack. And then so the immigrants start circling their wagons, making a bulwark. Outside of that wagon circle are two immigrants who were trailing cattle. One was named William Aden, and one was his companion, whose name we do not know. Joe White and Bill Stewart, two militiamen, they're heading back to Cedar to report to Haight this botched attack. They come across these two immigrant men who are behind, outside, trailing cattle. They think they need to contain the situation. They make a very bad decision that they think they need to kill them. They kill Aden, but Aden's companion gets away, gets inside the circle of immigrants. And so what they all say, they say everyone inside now knows it. They're all witnesses that were involved. And so that's where the cover-up begins, by killing all of them except for, they use the term over and over again, the children too young to tell tales. So the oldest two children were 6. There were a handful of children younger than that. Most of them were age 2 and babies. I mean, so they really only spared the very, very young children.
Gary.
So, Rick, this is for you. Okay. So you had 15 years now, right? Between the first and the second. If you had a chance to go back and revise the first book, would you make any changes to it?
Excellent question. Gary asked, since it's been 15 years since the first book, would we make any changes to the first book if we had a chance? I do have a little file that I keep, electronic file of changes I would make. None of them are really, really significant. Mostly it's added data that we found since that time to cover it. I still feel really good with the interpretation there as amended in the second book. Where we did have sort of new interpretations, you'll find them in the second book. Having written many books yourself, you know it's in some ways painful to go back and read your own writing. It's hard to do. It's like listening to yourself on tape if you've done that.
One of the new things that comes in the second book is this new motive or this new motivation. We kind of had when I say we, I was the content editor of Volume 1 working on this, but we touched on this. We kind of found little hints about this Indian strategy that Young had. It's all through the sources, but we had never put it all together and then looked at these attacks of other immigrant companies that are going on throughout the territory. And so when we figured that out, there's a new motive there that this encouragement is going on of cattle raiding throughout the territory at the time. So we emphasize that more in book 2.
And one of the rules that we followed for writing, which not everyone has the luxury to do, but we took the time to do it. We insisted that every place we write about, we would visit ourselves. So the final cattle raid occurs on October 3rd, and it's in the deserts near Las Vegas. So we went down there and we tracked the whole thing and found the canyon where the raid occurred. John D. Lee, partway through the book, he trails about 4 dozen head of cattle along the Paria River from Paria Settlement all the way down to Lee's Ferry, if you know where that is. And so Barbara and I and her husband Matt and several others, we did the 4-day hike through the Paria Slot Canyon to go there. So we made certain that we saw the territory so that when we're describing it, it wasn't just from our imaginations, it was from actual geography we had seen.
The worst part was when we had to go to Lake Powell. Okay, other questions?
What is your view of in some kind of hierarchy of whatever the other books that have been written? Why the drugs and real value?
Oh, what is our view of other books that have been written on the Mountain Meadows Massacre? Great question. So we dedicate our book to Juanita Brooks. And we end our book with Nephi Johnson, who I mentioned as a perpetrator, on his deathbed trying to tell the story to 19-year-old Juanita Brooks. So they kind of just brush fingertips, and then she goes on to write the first scholarly book on the massacre in 1950. So she's our hero. We stand on her shoulders. However, as Rick mentioned, she didn't have access. She was denied access to all of these amazing sources and interviews that we were given access to. And of course, we had the luxury of funding for a huge team of researchers to scour the country, gathering all kinds of sources. So she started it, and we have built on what she started tremendously. I mean, if you look at the book and look in the footnotes or endnotes and see the amount of sources we have, it's amazing what we and our team. And we really need to give credit to the huge team of researchers that also assisted us in this. It definitely was not just two of us. I'm going to let Rick talk about Will Bagley.
So Will and I were contrary to popular belief, we were good friends. We'd show up at the Mountain Meadows or other places, and cameras would come out shooting folks, pictures of us, putting them on Facebook or whatever. But we were really good friends, and Will used to say to people, who else am I going to talk to about this subject? The challenge, of course, with all books written prior to ours is, as Barbara's mentioned, they didn't have access to the sources, not just what Juanita Brooks was denied that we got, but it's that legal material that we mentioned that is so important for interpreting what actually happens in terms of the investigations and the cover-up and so forth. No one had the resources or the time to take all of that material and put it together. These two books required research in 31 of the 50 US states and 3 National Archives facilities on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., in College Park, Maryland, and in Denver, Colorado. So the material we gathered from this was massive, and what we did as far as putting these together now gives the opportunity for anybody who doesn't agree with us to go back and check the sources. We've made these things available. As I mentioned, we've got these 2 volumes, and we've got 4,000 pages on our mountainmeadowsmassacre.org website. So I want to express gratitude to everybody who's participated in what I sometimes call the renaissance of Mountain Meadows studies. I think it was long overdue, and we've had a flourishing of that in recent years, and I think it's healthy.
Including Craig Foster, who's here with us tonight. He did a lot of research on the family history of the victims,
Helping us out.
the people in Arkansas. Are there any others in the audience tonight that also were on research teams? Can't see way back there. Who's that?
That's Brent.
Oh, Brent Reber! Yay! Yeah, Brent Reber was our fabulous research team. So yeah, we just have so many people that contributed. We really need to honor and recognize all of them as well. So. Gary.
Sorry.
Oh, and then Julie, and then in the back. Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, are there any questions that you haven't been able to answer yet?
There are. I would love to know the name of the person who was with Joel White when they shot the 2 immigrants. He's an unnamed person. I would love to find an unexpurgated journal of a participant in the massacre. It's very clear that after the massacre, the people who were involved did what they could to cover it up themselves. One of the key documents that we use, and that's been used for years, has in the past been called Rachel Hamlin's Journal. Most people have used a typescript that circulated. We sent Chad Orton to the Huntington Library to look at the original and compare it to the typescript. The typescript is very defective, okay? In the typescript, you can't see things like the following. Well, first of all, we went through so-called Rachel's Journal and found out that the entries were on Mondays and Thursdays. What does that tell you? It was actually the Harmony Branch minutes. It wasn't her journal. The Lees took it into their possession to hide the evidence, went down through the Lee line, and became known as Rachel's Journal. It's not her journal at all. It's the local minutes of the Harmony Branch. They talk about how Lee leaves on Sunday, September 6th, with a party that goes southwest. And that's right there in the minutes. On September 13th, a week later when he comes back, if you look at the typescript, it says that he came from the south. And so it makes it look as though he came from the area of Washington, St. George area now, and didn't come from southwest, which had been the Mountain Meadows. So it looked like it exonerates him, and I've heard Lee family members and others over the years say, no, it shows right there in Rachel's journal that Lee was not there. He was on an expedition to the south. Well, if you find the original minutes at the Huntington Library, you go down to the bottom of the page that contains that, and it says that John D. Lee returned from an expedition south, And then it goes to the next line, which has been carefully cut out and probably said southwest with the Indians, which would then mirror what it said in the first part. So I'd love to find an unexpurgated record of a participant.
So someday, if I can bring myself to get back to working at Mountain Meadows again after 18 years between the two projects, I would love to do a book on the surviving immigrant children's story. We trace them all the way back to their return to their families in Arkansas, which is an incredibly touching chapter. We have the accounts from the families and the witnesses of what that was like when these 17 little children, well, it was, long story, but it was 15, later 17, returned. And they said this is all that returned of that splendid train that left from here a year and a half before. But I've talked to many of the descendants of those victims who've shared with me little stories and little vignettes of the little Dunlap girls running into their arms of their grandmother when they got home, and stories like that. So I'm tired of Mountain Meadows right now, but I think that would be a fantastic book to trace all of those 17 from the time of their return till the end of their lives. Would be a really important book. If anyone has energy and wants to do that, I'll work with you. So, but that's what I'd like to do. But if you'll see, you'll read this book, is incredibly detailed. It's incredibly detailed. We've filled in every source you can find. Okay, Julie.
Can you speak about Brigham Young's behavior prior to the massacre? Because he clearly wanted them harmed. They could have died because of his order to not sell them provisions.
Yeah.
So.
Sure. So the question up here was about Brigham Young's behavior prior to the massacre. So this unfolds in a time of war. President James Buchanan has sent troops to occupy the settlements of Utah. Brigham Young and other saints are worried about those approaching troops, and so they put in place a lot of war strategies to try and convince Congress, who wasn't in session when Buchanan sent out the troops, to pull the troops back. They also prepare for a siege. So Young is preaching against the federal government and against these troops that are coming, and he's saying we need to prepare for a siege. We're going to burn our settlements if those troops come and take it into the mountains. And so you need to start preparing by stockpiling your guns, your ammunition, and grain. And he says don't sell any grain to passing immigrants that may pass through. So that's one thing that contributes to it. Young is also using very violent rhetoric throughout the Mormon Reformation, which is also going on at this time, 1856 to 57. And so all of these things, and then of course by encouraging raiding of cattle companies, ultimately it led to this horrific crime. He, in all of that encouragement, he never says to kill anyone, but ultimately that those cattle raids and this one gone awry did lead to an atrocity.
Why would he be surprised at the atrocity after all that, though? That doesn't.
So Brigham Young was no dummy, and part of his instructions that was going down south at that time was to have no bloodshed, because he knew if blood were shed, that would give the approaching army rationale for attacking his people. So he was trying to avoid bloodshed. And the interesting thing about the grain embargo is that if you contextualize it to Utah generally in the 1850s, we can find that the grain embargo doesn't start in 1857. It begins earlier, because when the Saints arrive in the valley of the Great Salt Lake in 1847, they nearly starve over the winter, and then subsequent winters become, some of them, quite harsh, and so they begin to preach this idea of saving grain, this whole idea of food storage. They're preaching it early on, saying that you might have a period of time in which you're out of food and there's no stores to go to around. There's no Walmart, to go to. So save your grain to go from season to season and help make up in other times. So this was not a new order. It was a new order for 57, but it was an approach that had been given to keep the local people from starving over time. So.
One of the things I thought was interesting was he said, have a 2-year supply. You know where that comes from. Okay, back here in the blue.
Yeah, I'm just an amateur, but I've been trying to find out sources source of the George A. Smith diary or journals of that period? Are those available online? Or what's the easy way to get those?
Okay, so George A. Smith's materials. Oh, so the question was, he's trying to find George A. Smith's journals for this time period. So George A. Smith does have journals during the course of his life. Those journals take various forms. Sometimes they are actual journals, and there are pieces of those in various locations, including at the University of Utah. Sometimes, and particularly during this time period, they take the form of letters that he writes when he's on a trip back to the church historian's office that he's in charge of. And those effectively become his daily journals for that time period. So those are at church headquarters at the Church History Library.
Oh, they're not on the site.
You'd have to look at the site. We're putting, I say we, during my tenure there, I strongly encouraged putting documents up on a website. It was new after my coming there. And the number of pages that goes up there amounts to the millions per year. So if you don't find something one year, also when we created the system, we have a little request form below. If you find a record and it's not been digitized, you get to vote. Because our suggestion was, look, in the process of deciding what to digitize, let's let the user make me part of the decision about what we digitize. So if you see something that hasn't been digitized, vote.
And many of the George A. Smith sources that we cite in our book are online, because a lot of times we'd have to refer to them again. We just call them up through the Church History Library's website. So you can find a lot of
So those are historian's office journals. Those are all up.
Yeah. Pat?
You mentioned that the report that wells had been poisoned by the immigrants, or so they said. Somebody we listened to recently said they had traced that down and found anthrax that had come up with cattle from California.
Yeah,
And
that was probably us. And so what we did is, we did this in book 1, is we wanted to get at what, we know that the poisoning rumors are false. There was no poisoning. But we know for a fact there's a boy named Proctor Robinson that died. We know that there was a woman who was skinning cattle at the site. This is near Corn Creek, outside of Fillmore, Utah. Her hand turned black. She nearly died. We know multiple accounts of Pavan Indians in the area dying after this immigrant company passed through. We know that cattle were dying. And so we trace this in the book quite closely. What we did is, you want to talk about the doctors? Okay.
So although we didn't believe that we agreed with Jacob Forney, who said even if you had, first of all, why would any company carry that amount of poison? And even if they had put a huge amount of poison in the spring, its flow rate was such that it would have been washed away immediately. So this idea that they poisoned spring and subsequently people died through drinking it was ridiculous. We agreed with that, but we wanted to find out what was causing these symptoms. So we accumulated from various sources from 1855 to 1857 instances of people who had unexplained problems crossing the trail, and then as far north as Bountiful and as far south as San Bernardino. We pulled all of those instances together into a medical case file, and we brought in a panel of doctors that included people who academics. We gave them the various case descriptions, and we had them go off and consult. And they came back and said, without tissue samples, it's impossible to tell for sure, but our first guess is that it was anthrax. Well, then we knew that Proctor Robinson, 14-year-old, had died at Fillmore, and Barbara and I had been down there and others, we found his headstone. So we got to thinking about it, and I thought, okay, let's dig up the body and test it to see if we can get a tissue sample. So we had a friend, Eric Olson, who's a good patron of this institution here. Eric Olson was a local lawyer who had gone through a lot of effort to bring a couple of prominent Latter-day Saints from Mexico to Utah in the prior years. So I went to my friend Eric and I said, Eric, can you do the legal work for us to dig up this body? And then he said, yeah, you'll have to have the family's permission. So I thought, Proctor Robinson, let's see, who'd be the head of the Robinson clan? And then I thought, Clarence Robinson, the track coach at BYU. Well, he had recently passed away, but I called his widow, Manita Turley Robinson, my cousin here's laughing, and said, hey, we'd like to dig up Proctor's body. She said, by all means, we'll get you permission. So we got the family's permission, we got the legal documents, and then we had the body exhumed and then tested by lab in Arizona had nothing to do with the church in any way. We wanted to make certain that there could be no allegations of tampering with the evidence. They checked the soil, the body decomposed. They checked the soil around it and couldn't find any lingering anthrax spores. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen. They said, they could have faded by then.
One of the things that we looked at was one of the immigrants in the slaughtered train. His name was Peter Huff. He actually never made it to the Mountain Meadows because he died crossing the plains. And the accounts of his people said that they thought he died from a tarantula bite. And the symptoms of what happened to his hand were very similar to this woman near Fillmore happened to her hand. And his was one of the cases we shared with these doctors. Then they said, yeah, it appears that he died of anthrax as well. So it was being carried with cattle as they were crossing the plains that year. So, of course, in 1857, they didn't understand germ theory, so they're just searching for any reason they can come up with for these mysterious deaths. They come up with poison, but now we know it was microbes and it was naturally occurring anthrax. Okay, it's getting late, so
One more question?
one more question right here.
Can you talk about any other books the two of you might be working on?
Yes, we're both working on books. Okay, so after working on such a very depressing, tough, challenging, heart-wrenching subject for 18 years, I wanted to work on one that's inspiring and uplifting, and so I'm writing the biography of Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. Well-behaved woman who made history.
And I always have a lot of books going at one time. I once took David McCullough up to the Granite Mountain Records Vault. Along the way, I asked him, how he figured out what his next book was going to be. And he said, well, I keep all of these files of potential subjects. And when I finish one book, I look at the files and I say, which one of you is ready? And I go to that one and check the contents to see if there's enough there to write the book, and then I do it. And that's very much like what I do. I've got 24 book projects that I have underway in one form or another. I retired about 2 years ago, and I've decided to spend my early retirement years focused on Joseph Smith. More about that later. But I also have this long-standing interest in John Wesley Powell. When we were doing Vengeance is Mine, we kept running into John Wesley Powell and his men in the wilderness of southeastern Utah. Places like Scutumpar, where John D. Lee had a home, okay? Or on the Colorado, at Lee's Ferry and elsewhere. Kanab, they had their winter quarters at Kanab, and they were hiring, you see this in the book, they're hiring people who were participants in the Mountain Meadows Massacre as federal employees and giving them a federal paycheck, okay? So I became very interested in John Wesley Powell, and as I mentioned, geographically, we went to these places, and I started thinking, I gotta write about Powell. So I have a project underway to write 3 volumes on John Wesley Powell's river trips, one on his 1869 trip, one on his 1871 trip, and one on his 1872 trip. Now you might say, well, why is it necessary? Didn't Wallace Stegner do it all? And the answer is no. And I'll give you a couple of teasers why not. There are 2 bodies of experts on John Wesley Powell. One is the academic crowd that spends most of its time in archives and libraries writing. And the other is the river crowd, okay? Now, the academic crowd will look at what Powell has written, like his 1875 Government Printing Office report that's been republished again and again and again and again, and is carried by rafters through the canyons every year. And they'll take that as gospel. If you go down the river, where I spend time every year, and you talk to the river guides, they'll look at Powell, they'll look at the geography. They'll look at Powell, they'll look at the geography. They'll look at Powell, and they'll look at the geography, and they'll go, no way. It turns out that just as the sources for Mountain Meadows were treacherous, so are the sources for John Wesley Powell. His 1875 account, taken as gospel by many scholars, is in fact an amalgamation of all 3 of his trips that includes moving events around, exaggerating the height of rapids, and doing other things that are just, by modern historical standards, not acceptable. So this project involves 3 things for me. One is deconstructing the sources, which I love to do. I love to sort of get down to the nitty-gritty sources. It involves also getting what I can from archives and other sources. I'm finding new stuff that other people haven't found before, as we did with Mountain Meadows. And then number 3, I'm experiencing the river with river people. And so every year I do at least one river trip. Barbara and her husband Matt have gone on one of these trips with me.
Downstream of the dam, Colorado.
Well, actually all over. So last year I did the entire Grand Canyon, 17 days from Lee's Ferry all the way to Pierce Ferry. But you know, I'm doing every part that I can possibly do for the book.
So just to add to this last answer, we want to emphasize that this is not just a Mormon story. This is not just a Utah story. This is an American story. And there are some key American figures that come out throughout the book. Rick just mentioned one, John Wesley Powell. Sam Houston plays a role in one of the chapters in Texas. And also Samuel Clemens, the young Samuel Clemens, who passes through Utah in 1861 and meets Brigham Young. And later, in his book called Roughing It, he writes about his impressions about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. I was privileged. I was so glad I was working on this project because I put in a proposal. I got to go to Elmira and be a writer in residence in the farm where Samuel Clemens wrote Roughing It in 1871. And I got to sit at his desk where he wrote Roughing It in 1871 and write about what he wrote about roughing, about passing through Utah. It was surreal. It's the same place where he wrote Tom Sawyer and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. So I did that for 2 summers. So that American story is in the book. So there's countless American stories woven throughout the book. So we hope that this catches on nationally and not just in Utah or in Mormon studies circles.
And now you don't have to wonder why it took so long.
Yeah, we covered it all. So, all right. Thank you very much.